Our story begins as we see a red sky reminiscent of the apocalypse, with a volcano erupting in the background and several people at war on the ground, with birds or perhaps dragons flying overhead amidst the sky and various debris flying. It appears to be the heroes' group under the mountain, with him standing in front of them, observing. Until he announces that he is coming as they prepare. We see the wings of some monsters, seemingly demons, smiling with excitement-filled eyes for the battle and heading towards the heroes, and an immense dragon approaches them, towering over all the others. We see that it is the Dragon King, called Horntail, with 3 heads, each different from the other, glaring furiously ahead. The blonde girl in our protagonist's group remarks that it seems like the Kentaurus area has fallen, and there's nothing left for them to rely on now. She mentions some groups they knew, such as the Cygnus Knights, the Resistance, Silent Crusade, and the Explorers, and even the 6 heroes, once hailed as the people's hope. She looks sadly ahead, saying all these groups are now dead, only they remain, as the wind blows through her hair. She looks at our protagonist, saying he is the only one left of all those she mentioned, the last explorer, as he looks back at her, and she calls him Elpam. Elpam tells them to go, saying this is their final adventure, as his whole group prepares to fight the huge dragon. We only see its shadow looming over them, until the dragon roars towards them, while our hero prepares his fire magic in his hand and the others draw their swords. Some time later, we see the entire area destroyed by fire and huge smoke covering the surrounding forest, and we see Elpam, bloody and still standing, but seemingly very weak despite everything. Until he finally collapses to the ground, next to the lifeless bodies of all his adventurer friends who fought alongside him, until we see the dragon's head on the ground too, covered in blood, and he remains on his knees. He decides to look up and asks if it's all over now, somewhat surprised. However, the 3-headed dragon still looms in the evening sky, with 2 heads remaining, despite losing one, until Elpam thinks the head he barely managed to cut off is regenerating again, saying all they've done so far has been in vain. As the head regenerates, the dragon starts flying towards him to kill him as well, and Elpam just looks at it tiredly, until he simply decides to accept his end after everything, closing his eyes, thinking this is where it all ends now. As he kneels on the ground, he thinks this is the end of the world and even of his adventures so far, until he denies all of this, hitting the ground in anger with his hand, covered in blood. He tries to gather his determination from before the battle, thinking not to joke about it. He grits his teeth and becomes very bloody, asking if this is really how it all ends, as his veins pulsate on his face, until he remembers some of his comrades killed by the dragon, starting with Philip, who was crushed, Jodin, who lay dead on the ground, even Elisis, the blonde girl who fought with him, was about to be devoured by the monster. She starts smiling and crying to our hero, as he says all his companions sacrificed themselves for him, until he suddenly lifts his head and starts screaming loudly to the sky, furious about it all. He says he refuses to accept it like this, and then he decides to get up from the ground, still very tired. He stares at the dragon intently, calling it by its name Horntail, as his eyes turn red from the blood dripping, and he sighs, raising his hand towards the dragon still in the sky, saying it can't end like this, and he begins to shout intensely and invoke his fire spell again, while holding his hand. He gathers a lot of magic, as we see what seems to be a fire spear forming slowly above his head with the accumulation of magic. He shouts that no matter what happens from now on, until we see a huge fire arrow formed. However, to his misfortune, he totally loses control of his power, with his fire arrow breaking into several pieces and him spitting blood, wondering what happened suddenly, until he vomits blood on the ground, forming a puddle. And to his misfortune, the dragon starts preparing an attack towards him, coming from the middle head, a purple attack with a breath, until it launches everything towards our hero, and as it was about to hit him directly with the dragon's powerful breath, he calls it a pathetic bastard, wondering why it had to end like this after all. He says it would be easier if he just had more power to protect them, begging for one more chance to fix everything again. Until someone suddenly shouts at him to get up, offending him and calling him a brat, while throwing water at him, and then our hero finally wakes up, opening his eyes intensely, shocked, and throwing water at him again. Until we see our protagonist with his hands tied and a collar around his neck, and he wonders what's going on, and the man shouts asking if he's pretending to be sick now. We see a bald man standing in front of him, furious with him as he says he's a terrible slave, that he was even getting relaxed. But our hero, not paying attention to his words, he asks what's happening to him all of a sudden, and wonders where Horntail is. He thinks to himself if it's alive right now, not believing it, until he opens his eyes attentively and stops to think a little about it, thinking to himself that he knows this place, as the other soldiers say something about the new slaves. Our hero clenches his fists again in anger, thinking he really knows this place. As the guard thanks someone for the sponsorship, we see some people discussing about buying one of the people in the cell and a trading city at nightfall, and our protagonist realizes it's the slave market. He starts to sigh heavily, thinking to himself there's no way out of here, and wonders if the slave market shouldn't have disappeared long ago. He says no matter how much he looks around, he says he really remembers the merchant in front of him, while the bald guy insults all of them, saying all they have is their pathetic lives, and that they are just slaves. Elpham explains that he was in charge of him in the past when he was a slave about 6 years ago, and really says it must be him. And if that's the case, he thinks he's gone back to the past. But as he reflects looking at the bald guy, he becomes uncomfortable with it and very angry, until he directs his hand towards him to hit him and asks what he's looking at. As the fist was getting close to him, he thinks on this day he returned to the starting point of the whole story. After some time, we see his nose bleeding from the punch he received from the guard. He kneels on the ground thinking if maybe he could be dreaming at this exact moment. He quickly denies it, saying this all seems too real for him to be called a dream. He thinks it's hard to believe this, but there's no other plausible explanation for all this, as we see the merchant offering some slaves to passing adventurers, and asks them to choose one carefully while smiling. He says they're all fresh, just arrived, and as the guy next to him says he'll buy the two in this case, while Elpham still thinks about it all, thinking there's no reason to complicate this, and thinks this is definitely his second chance in life, while looking determinedly ahead. After some time, we see our hero holding a staff in his hands as he raises it, saying that this staff is the Ifrit's arrow staff, and it's not a bad skill, thinking it should be suitable for his level. Until he starts walking while holding a spear in his hands and the staff on his back, thinking that this isn't enough, and that an explorer like him should have more than just one weapon, and thinks otherwise it doesn't make sense for him to come here to cultivate, until as he walked, he finds a severed leg on the ground, and upon closer inspection, he finds several other body parts scattered around, thinking this happens because some people tend to hide valuable items they find in their shoes, until he takes off the guy's boot and finds a ring, deciding to put it on his index finger, until suddenly the ring starts glowing, and he's very surprised by this, thinking this is the psychokinesis ring. But with no time to reflect on the ring and test it, he notices some monsters coming towards him from behind. As they begin to surround him, the monsters look furious at him, with their red eyes under the shadows, and our hero wonders if they were attracted by the smell of blood, preparing for battle, pointing his spear at them, and the monsters start preparing to chase after him, and begin to move towards him to kill him quickly. However, Elpham uses his attack on one of them, easily splitting the monster in two with just a few strikes, while the other monster extends its tongue towards him. However, Elpham extends his spear to protect himself from its tongue quickly. But to his misfortune, the monster breaks his spear in two, and Elpham is very surprised by this, not believing it. As he reflects on this, another monster appears behind him, with its mouth open to simply devour him quickly without wasting time. However, he uses his fire arrow spell. While his staff glowed, he manages to dodge the monster behind him and use the spell to pierce it without wasting time, while Elpam thinks about the ring, that maybe he should test it on the monsters, and then, as he held his fire arrow ready, he extends his hand with the ring and his hand starts glowing the same color as the ring, and we see what exactly he did. He used the ring with his fire arrow to bend the strike and kill several monsters at once, saving on the use of his magic with just one strike, and then the fire arrow gradually dissipates as they all died. With all fallen on the ground, dead, and with a fire burning beside them, our hero thinks that there's still a little duration left, and the remaining monsters look at him with much fear, surprised by this, and Elpam extends his staff to finish them off, thinking he doesn't care about the ring at the moment, until something unexpected happens, and he thinks his fire arrow wasn't activated, and the monsters quickly move towards him to attack him, but he successfully dodges. He continues thinking that the staff doesn't seem to be broken despite everything, and wonders if it's on cooldown if that's the case. And then another monster opens its mouth again to devour him, but he then steps on the ground and spins his staff, hitting the monster with all his strength, thinking he doesn't need help. He starts hitting the monster over and over again without wasting time, while the monster begins to retreat slowly until he extends his foot and kicks it, making it fly away quickly until he looks at the staff and asks if the cooldown is over, and he gathers fire magic again on his staff gradually, while the three-eyed monster goes towards him again, and Elpam says that this is really great. While staring at them, he shoots his fire arrow forward, with the monsters beside him, thinking he will use the ring once more, making the ring glow again, and several fire bursts go towards the monsters with the attack split, piercing all of them quickly and killing them in the blink of an eye, while we see our hero with his determination under one of the holes he just made, with an incredible scene of him, as he watches the fallen monsters on the ground intently. We see a person screaming and agonizing, bleeding heavily, until he starts crawling towards him, and says that he has become then an ordinary common slave, and our hero looks back, noticing the person and thinking that they're still alive, as the girl looks at him attentively, but very wounded, and she mentions some spells he casted, and asks who the hell he is to be able to do these things, and Elpam thinks to himself that she's indeed very lucky, or rather, maybe the opposite of that. As the girl questions him again, and asks if he killed all of them himself, and looks at his wrist, saying it's a magic circle he has there, she shouts furiously, and asks how a slave like him awakened, as she notices something, wondering if it was him behind all of this, as we see some dead people on the ground. Apparently he set up a trap to kill the team members who had bought him, while he looks at the girl with some disgust, with hatred in his eyes. As the forest falls into complete silence, he asks if she's done talking, and she's confused about it, until Elpam apologizes to her, saying she misunderstood all of this, and says maybe this all didn't matter in the end, and says he would have killed all of them in the end, while the girl thinks this is total nonsense. He says menacingly to the girl that he definitely hates all of them, while the girl suddenly becomes very afraid, until he prepares his fire magic towards the girl, and says he hates those who use humans as bait. After some time later, we see a huge city until we focus on some random people, not believing what they're seeing, wondering if this is serious, totally shocked, saying to think that just a slave managed to return alone, while we see our hero walking under the city without worries. He thinks his luck has been cast, thinking he needs to hurry so as not to end up with a repeated ending like before, and thinks he needs to do something first, while he stands still in front of an establishment, thinking to himself that he needs to get rid of this slave mark as soon as possible. Meanwhile, inside the place our hero was staring at, one of them wonders if a slave really returned alive alone, and the man says yes, that's exactly what happened, calling him a vis, standing in front of a table with a guy smoking. He explains that he saw the slave return without even a scratch, while the guy asks what's the problem with that, wondering if it's really so uncommon for a slave to return totally unscathed and uninjured. The man in front of Avis explains that there were rumors that the explorer group accompanying him had died inside the gate, until the guy is shocked, asking if only the slave survived that, and we see the guy in front of him saying that this is certainly a special case. While he wears an eye patch and has braided hair, he keeps talking and asks if he came back on his own volition instead of fleeing, and is even more impressed. He explains that those who became slaves due to debts are used as slaves again, even if they return on their own volition, and says that since he didn't try to escape despite that, he says the slave is clearly aware that it would be difficult for him to escape their grasp, saying the reason for this is simple, and that the only means of escape is only death. The guy crosses his arms and ponders, and says if that's their way, the Gapper merchants, while we see a flag under his office with what appears to be 2 scales. The man addresses the guy in front of him and asks if he should report all the insignificant cases he encounters, while the guy closes his eyes and says there's another special detail he still needs to mention, and says the slave awakened the first circle. Until the eye patch guy finally becomes surprised by this, unable to believe what he just said. He inquires about a slave like him awakening the first circle, until he ponders on it, thinking that since he lived as a slave, he wouldn't have any particularly good feelings towards them in case things go wrong, until the gray-haired guy addresses him again, saying that he also requested a change to his contract. The smoking guy wonders about this. He says he seems to want to register as an explorer, leaving the eye patch guy shocked again, unable to believe what he said. He wonders if a slave really said this, saying he really doesn't know his place in this world, while the gray-haired guy says there are orders from Lord Racken for him to personally check this matter, until the eye patch guy is surprised again, shouting Racken's name, seeming to be someone important after all. He thinks about Racken, wondering why a market executive or merchant would be interested in a mere slave like him. He wonders if maybe it couldn't be because of that, as he stares at some of the books that were on his desk, and then, after a little while after that, the guy leaves, closing the door, while Avis stands in front of the window, wondering about the slave who wants to become an explorer. We change the scene then, while it is mentioned that under the name of Empress Cygnus, no slave status will exist, but that was only on the outside of how things work, explaining that humans have always been slaves of Misos. It's further explained that if they borrowed Misos but couldn't pay, they would pay with their personal labor. He continues explaining that this simple concept created a status similar to that of a slave in the world, and says that on the day his father, his only family, had died from an illness, he had become one of them too. He explains that everything happened because he had bought medicine for his father with an account from the Gapper merchants called Black Moss, and says that they calculated the price of this black moss at 1 million Misos, several times higher than its market price. And then Elpham stands up as it seems to be a trial court. The old man explains that since the defendant failed to reimburse the 1 million Misos he had borrowed from the Gapper merchants within the deadline, he shall reimburse them with work equal to the corresponding value, as he pounds the gavel on the table, much like a judge. And he explains that's how it happened, as they extorted 6 years of his life, and says now it's time to pay them back, as we see Elpham, our hero, under the same table with the Gapper executive, having tea. He introduces himself to the guy as Elpham, and he thinks about the guy's name, wondering if he's called Avis, Racken's left arm, one of the Gapper merchant's executives, and he thinks that apparently he got a decent person to negotiate with. As the guy sips his tea, he asks Elpham if he would like to change the contract then. He says he had received reports about him before, and says he'll get straight to the main issue, until he places his cup on the table and says he'll arrange for him to be a level F explorer and change his contract quickly, saying this seriously to him, while Elpham becomes suddenly astonished. Until Elpham starts smiling and thanks him, and thinks to himself that he had accepted the terms too easily, and he thinks that's just as he had thought, saying he's being very cautious in the end. Until Elpham addresses him, saying that however, he would like to request to become a rank E, while smiling convincingly at the guy in front of him, and thinks again that he has no plans to follow his schemes at the moment. Avis wonders about becoming a rank E, and asks if he really wants to demand that since he doesn't even have an explorer rating yet, until Elpham explains that he has ventured into the gates hundreds of times as a bait slave over the past 3 years. while Avis says that even if he says that, that's his experience as bait, saying he has no experience in killing monsters, until Elpam interrupts him and asks since when hunting monsters was a virtue quality of an explorer. While Avis asks about this, he explains that the reason the first explorer managed to make his name known was because he managed to survive, and says that the virtue of an explorer is to return alive after an adventure. Avis rests his hand on the table and ponders on this, saying that the information of who returns tends to have much more impact than that of a strong individual, until he says he admits it. He says he's certainly right. After all, surviving for 3 years as a bait slave is not an easy task, and says that however, that's all he has in the end, saying that the gates where slaves are used as bait enter are of low difficulty, and asks if he thinks a mere survival ability would work in a higher level gate. As he picks up a cigar, the man says the young man must think they were fools to give dangerous contracts to people who would die without even paying any misos. It was something very crazy. The young man remained silent. As the man smoked, he thought he still hadn't realized his place, and it wouldn't be long until he found his end. But however, he wondered what strange feeling that was. The man draws the young man's attention, saying there was a 12-mark gate and a 5-entry limit. And the man smiles, saying yes. He says he was talking that a minimum of 12 parties used that place as a graveyard, and looks at the boy, telling him to prove himself. If it happens, he's worth so much, he says with a demonic smile as he hands a contract to him, that he'll do what he wants. Soon our protagonist finds himself with a group of 4 people. They recognize him as the newcomer who decided to go with them. The most proactive young man introduces himself as Chev. He was the team's tank, and says he heard about him from Mr. Avis, and asks if he was originally a bait slave. He says he didn't care about things like that, so he tells him not to worry and introduces his comrades. Our young protagonist says he's now under their care, and that he knew how to cast fire element spells. One of Chev's comrades approaches, asking what he was talking about, if he thought the elements should be predetermined, and the young man says yes. Chev says that mages are unable to use elements other than those with which they are inherently compatible. Chev smiles and says they say it's useless for them to have items with elements different from theirs, and asks if he had heard about it. Now, with everyone together, Chev suggests they leave the conversation for later. As he must have heard, the mission's objective was not to hunt monsters. He says their goal is to safely retrieve the items left by the 12 groups that were annihilated before them. Chev says the mission ends when they return the items they recover to the merchants. The last time he heard, they were offering 3,000 misos per item. His comrade then asks if they aren't offering too little. If there were items used by First Circle users, then they should be giving at least over 7,000 misos. But they are not even giving half of what he considered fair. His colleague tells him to stop whining, and as they argue, Chev says it's time to go now, and asks if everyone is ready, as it's time to make some misos. Soon we see deeper into the forest. The team was gathered within the dark forest. One of the comrades says it's clear, but still strangely cold. Chev instructs everyone to pay attention. He says the dense forest will likely prolong this mission, so they should first establish a base. One of his colleagues points to the tree and asks why not climb it. It seemed like a good place, since all those branches, and they could also move to other trees if there was any trouble. And Chev says it's not a bad idea and agrees, telling them to go ahead. Soon they throw the ropes and daggers on the ground. One of the adventurers approaches our protagonist and says he could rest, and says he and his ugly colleague would be in charge of building the base. And after establishing a base on the tree, Chev says they would now explore the nearby area by splitting into 2 groups. He says Tom, Max, and Ro, those 3 would be the first team. Elpam and Chev would be the second group, each covering the eastern and western side. If anything happens, he asks them to send a signal and quickly head back to the base to enter. After agreeing, Pam and Chev continue walking through the forest. Chev says there isn't a single monster, let alone any item, and he wonders if they positioned their base a little too close to the road, and it seemed necessary to delve a little deeper tomorrow. and changing the subject, he asks Pam, who remained serious, what he was thinking of his first mission as an explorer, and he says he was nervous. And Chev says it's understandable, as it usually was the case. Chev says for him, he still gets nervous every time he enters the gate, although he started his adventure some time ago because he's a coward. He says the reason he is able to be brave is because of the good people around him. It's kind of weird to say that, but his comrades were all good people. Chev says honestly, he felt sorry when he heard his story. A bait slave, Chev couldn't imagine how hard it must have been for him, so he says if it's okay with Elpam, he could join his team. But Elpam remains silent, seeing that he seems not to have liked it much. Chev says he spoke only by chance, and he could ignore what he had told him. Later, all five were camping around a campfire. They hadn't found anything. Chev says it really wouldn't be that easy. Chev asks why not stop talking about work and eat in peace. It won't be late even if they continue with it tomorrow after they sleep. Elpam just drinks his water in his corner, and soon the moon shines brightly over the forest as the night progresses, calmness taking over the adventurer's base in the tree. Soon one of the adventurers approaches with a lit torch and asks if he was sleeping. It was Chev and his colleagues. But Elpam remains wrapped up. One of his colleagues puts his hand on his shoulder and asks what he was doing, and he says there's no way someone could be sleeping by now. They were with a very suspicious smile on their faces and seemed to want some answers from Elpam. His companions say Chev was very worried as they had already mixed something in his food. A sleeping agent that would instantly drop even a large animal, and he had drunk so much that it would be a surprise if he didn't die because of it. Anyway, a fire staff would earn them at least 10,000 misos. Chev then raises his dagger and asks what he thinks of the job now, ready to deliver the final blow. But as he pierces the blanket, he notices something strange. Under the blanket, there was only a log, tied with some pillows. Pam was no longer there. That scares the adventurers who wonder how that could be happening. Chev orders them to find him immediately. He could still be hiding nearby. But soon a large explosion in the base sends him flying away, and on the forest floor, a shadow sees the base being consumed by fire with the adventurers still up there. The adventurers wonder what was happening, and Chev orders them to quickly grab the items and retreat, while everyone wonders if Pam was responsible for all this. Soon one of the adventurers tells Chev to look in a direction, and when he looks he is faced with a giant slimy monster with a gigantic eye focused on them. Chev looked terrified as he knew that was Elpam's doing. He had used them as bait. While the monster prepares to attack, they throw themselves out of the base, while the monster chomps down on their base. Meanwhile, Elpam just watches, while thinking it was very careless of them. If they wanted to deceive him, they shouldn't have acted kindly towards him. He thought as he watched the adventurers fleeing for their lives that they were receptive to someone who was originally a bait slave, let alone looking for a veteran explorer, which meant they had ulterior motives that said the boss of that place was indeed that being, as he had thought. As he watched the adventurers fleeing from the monster, he says he assumed it would appear from the traces of corrosion, but it's much larger than he expected. The creature moves too fast as it runs. Chev says they are completely at a disadvantage. One of his colleagues asks him if he knows what monster that is. Chev says if he's right, that was a monster called the Golden Slime. It was a rare boss monster which cannot be seen on the world map. As the Golden Slime runs very fast, he says that monster only appears in red gates. Its body is composed of acids, so it's the worst opponent for us to fight hand to hand like this. The ground steams from the slime's temperature lingering on the ground. Chev notices something approaching, narrowly escaping a slime blast. They wonder what kind of thing that is. As the ground melts from the temperature, they seem surprised that the monster uses long-range attacks. It was an acid arrow, a skill that releases acid from inside its body, which left the adventurers desperate. It seemed like cheating. Chev orders his friend to control himself, as it would attack them again. They run again while the slime continues to move. They ask the boss what they could do against that monster, and if they could even fight that thing at all. He says they needed to regroup and find an opportunity to destroy the core centered on the monster's head. One of Shev's bravest colleagues scoffs at the fact that he's asking him to wait. He then heads towards the monster, while his colleagues call after him. Max charges in saying it's been too long, and asks him to leave it to him. Shev says they need everyone together, but Max is split by an acid blast, leaving Shev completely shocked by the scene. It didn't make sense. There were more than 10 seconds left for his cooldown, and the monster starts launching dozens more blasts.
Soon we see several bodies reduced to bones by the slime's acids.
Our protagonist, watching everything hidden behind a tree, says it seems like it's all over. Elpem thought he wasn't wrong. The golden slime gets stronger according to the number of items it consumes. His mistake was thinking that his cooldown would decrease as it grew. It's an abnormally large size and an acid arrow without cooldown. Elpem could see why the other teams that came before them were all eliminated. That thing was way beyond their casual level. It grew strong enough to even live in the yellow gate, which was 2 stages above the red one. He observes the monster leaving while thinking it was impossible for a first circle explorer to defeat that monster now. He continues behind the tree while thinking that there were no more items left in that gate. The mission was already a failure. He then remembers his employer laughing and telling him to prove his worth. He then smiles discreetly. The slime, moving home, ends up noticing something and approaches and receives a blast that hits its head directly. Its remains fall to the ground, deteriorating it. The monster lets out a grunt of pain. Elpem wonders if he had resisted because of magic resistance. Not bad, especially when he aimed at its core. Seeing the wound he had caused, he thinks 4 more shots would be enough, or maybe even 5. He then draws his dagger while thinking it doesn't matter, and raises his dagger with a confident smile. He was ready to show his worth. The slime launches some acid blasts in all directions, but Elpem ends up dodging. The slime continued spewing acid everywhere, but Elpem kept dodging even in the air. He swings on a rope, feeling his ring burning. His rope was attached to his dagger. He needed to hit the same spot, without making a single mistake. If he were an ordinary mage, it would be inconceivable. But it was possible for him. As he prepared to approach, he remembered the title he had in his previous life. He was the greatest psychokinesis mage. He then creates a bow with his staff and prepares a fire arrow and shoots it again directly at the slime monster. Now he just needed 4 more, and the monster then spits out another barrage of acid, but Elpem ends up dodging, using his dagger with a rope. He then prepares another fire arrow and hits it again directly. Only 3 shots left. The monster fires even more blasts. As Pam swings by his rope, he turns and hits it again, leaving only 2 shots left, and then shoots another arrow and leans against the trunk of a tree. He realizes the monster had dodged and thinks it was too fast for a slime, but it didn't make sense because with his ring he makes the arrow return directly to the slime, hitting it again directly. Elpem prepares his last shot. Meanwhile, the monster's hand approaches him, closer and closer. Elpem soon realizes something approaching from behind. He then uses his ring magic again, making it retreat and saving him from the monster's attack. He steps on the ground to support himself and already prepares for another attack. He shoots another fire arrow. The monster tries to raise its hand to defend itself, and Pam smiles confidently, then makes his arrow curve and hit the monster directly again, finally hitting its core, which begins to collapse. The slime's body starts to collapse and bubble, ready to almost explode. The beast's eyes begin to be swallowed. Elpem then runs to escape the blast radius. The slime's acid starts falling on all sides, and Elpem runs to escape the monster's remains, which were highly corrosive. Elpem then uses his rope to hit a dagger on a branch, and it wraps around a branch, serving as a base for him to climb onto it and save himself from the sea of acid. Elpem looks back and sees the forest immersed in acid. The forest terrain was completely devastated. After the acid level decreased, he finally steps on the ground and walks through the remains of the slime. Elpem then notices something that catches his attention. He reaches out as he notices a glowing spot, and soon a core emerges from the ground and flies towards him. He then holds the small red ball in the palm of his hand, and soon it begins to glow intensely, and soon power begins to overflow from the core as it floats above Elpam's hand. Suddenly, a barrier begins to surround our protagonist, and soon we see him back at his employer's residence, notifying him that he has returned from his mission. The man was silent with his arms crossed as he smoked his cigar. He then says he was right in his thinking Elpam wasn't a braggart, but he had returned alone and also didn't bring any of the requested items. Elpam says the members he assigned to him were beginner hunters. They were planning to take the items he had. And with closed eyes, he says that when he split to avoid them, they must have all died after encountering the gigantic boss. The man then asked what monster it was, and Elpam says it was the golden slime, which catches his employer's attention. After all, that monster of all things, in that case the items must have all melted away, and Elpam confirms the information. The man becomes frustrated realizing that all the items he lent out were melted and disappeared. It was enormous damage without a doubt. And moreover, the biggest problem was that Elpam had managed to escape. We find out that there are some common rules for the gates. First, there is a limit to the number of people who can enter a gate. And as soon as a group enters the gate according to the number of members marked on the gate pillar, the gate will be deactivated until all the members who entered the gate die. And second, there is an entry restriction depending on the gate's difficulty and the circle numbers. From the red gates to the purple gates, one can know the difficulty of a gate by its color. In addition, someone with a circle larger than the gate's difficulty cannot enter it. And third, there is only one opportunity given to pass the gate. This rule is the most obstructive in gate releases, as if one of the entrance members survived and exited the gate, that gate disappeared and would be impossible to enter again. As long as an explorer who entered through the gate does not die, there is no other opportunity. The man then thinks it's been a long time for the gate, and honestly, the golden slime would have been too much for the first circles to handle. He then says that as he could see, he barely managed to survive from there. Since all the items would have melted as he said, then he had not been able to retrieve them. Whatever the reason, he had failed the mission. The boy listens quietly and then says that the man was being too hasty. He hadn't finished talking yet, which leaves the man surprised. He then pulls a thread from his shirt, and the man seems quite scared at what he was about to see. He then shows a shining symbol on his wrist and says he ate it all. The man is surprised to see the second circle, so you absorbed the magic stone that came out of the golden slime. Our hero said that it seemed he had proven his worth. Now he demands the rank E, as the man had promised. But the man talks about rank D, something that leaves Elpam quite surprised. But the man leaps onto the table saying they should quickly go to rank D, but soon changes his mind and says that if he works for him, he will treat him as a level C explorer. While Elpam signed a contract, the man thought that treating someone who hasn't reached the third circle as a rank C explorer would be very outrageous. An explorer's rank is greatly influenced by the circle. We see a pyramid where we have the beginner explorer of level E and F at the base. In the middle, we see the junior explorer of rank C and D, and the veteran explorer at the top of the pyramid, rank A and B. Because the circle is power, the differences between the circles are glaringly obvious. But he knew Elpam wasn't an ordinary guy. He wondered if it was his survival instincts. The man smiles and says he really had that survival instincts, not overwhelming talent. Someone who just became the first circle returned as a second circle in an instant. He had never seen anyone as fast as Elpam. He needed to have him working with him. Elpam thought that treatment with him improved much faster than he expected. He must be in a hurry, and sighed as he signed. After all, it was as expected. Even so, it wasn't too long. The first red note was the subjugation of 100 men. The big event for which all the mercantile groups and guilds of Light Port turned their eyes back to started at that time. Naturally, the merchants of Gapper would also be very interested in that, and there's nothing bad for Elpam since he was in a hurry too. He thought that while putting the pen on the table, it won't be bad to advance with his plan. He then tells Mr. Canovis that he would like to ask for one thing, and the man asks him to speak comfortably. He then reaches out and asks him to lend him some misos. The man grumbles as he holds his cigar, as he seemed deeply bothered. Soon we are introduced to the gate story. Some said it opened the era of adventures. But all this was a trap of the Black Mage. Many explorers lost their lives in the gates, and the potential of the border world was slowly corroded. Then the last day arrived. Countless monsters that were waiting for their time came out of the gates, and so they were defeated. Exactly 3 years from now, the moment of destiny that the border world would face was not far away. Soon we see Avis smoking his cigar as he looked out the window. What was at the end of his vision was our protagonist, who was walking alone in the opposite direction of the building. He thought it wasn't enough, but this should be enough to start. The gate of 100 men discovered is a red grade. Only second circles and below are allowed. Normally, gapper merchants are the type that chooses and hires high circle explorers. But the reason they're investing in me is because they're aiming for that gate. Elpam said he got some misos for now, but it would be foolish of him to spend them on items. Besides, the kind of items he needed now would be very expensive. He soon arrives at a location and reads a plaque made of metal. From his look, it seemed to be a fundamental place. Soon a man approaches him, welcoming him to the labor market, and says he must be an explorer and offers to let him help. While we see people negotiating, the man wonders what he was looking for, bait for a dungeon or a warrior to fight by his side. Elpam says he was looking for someone else and asks him to guide him there. The man seems surprised but gladly takes him. They then descend to the underground, and he says those were the punishment chambers, often used to discipline those who don't listen, like the person he was looking for. Soon they stop, and the man introduces Elpam to who he was looking for. We see someone chained up, and the guide swallows hard, then turns to Elpam asking if he's really going to choose him. And before he says who that person was, Elpam interrupts him and says he knows who he is. Soon we see a man totally chained up. Our hero says he was the one he was looking for. We find out that after his return, there was a death that advanced the destruction of the border world. Hero of the polearm, Aaron, and she was murdered. Aaron's first disciple and the perpetrator who declared the beginning of destruction, divine assassin hero, a young man with a fierce look. Elpam seemed enchanted to see the beginning of that whole situation, the one responsible for everything. Devo asks why he was here for him. It was the first time he saw him. The merchant apologizes for Devo's misbehavior. His mental state wasn't the best. While looking at Devo's enraged look, our hero thought he might not know what happened before his return. But he is just a slave for now. Seeing how he was showing attitude to an explorer, it wasn't just something that can be considered rude. The merchant says he's a complete lunatic and a mad dog. Elpam smiles as he thought it wasn't just his personality, but also his ability. After all, they both received more attention from people after the last day that happened. As such, he was often compared to Devo, simply because of many similar factors, like being from the same region, the awakening time, and the ability. Soon the man lights the torch and frees Devo. Elpam then asks how he's doing. Devo stretches and says that contrary to his appearance, he must be a fancy boy, and asks if he could give him the value he was asking for. Devo smiles challengingly and mentions the price of 1,000,000 misos, and asks what he thinks. Would it be a good price for the young master? And we find out something else they had in common. They both needed misos. He needed misos because he had a sister suffering from the black blood disease. Devo then tells him to give up if he has nothing, or if he's going to boast. But our hero puts his hand in his pocket, making Devo's eyes shine. He then lifts a bundle of notes, making Devo scream in surprise at seeing 1,000,000 misos. Neither Devo nor the merchant seemed to believe that someone was walking around with so much money. Devo then swallows hard, and our protagonist says it's not time yet and puts the money away. He says he'll listen carefully now. The duration of the contract is 1 year, and the profits will be 7-3. The priority of the items obtained in the gate will come to him. The merchant wonders if he was saying he would hire him as a comrade and not as a slave. He then grabs a contract and offers it to Devo. He says it's better not to go back on his word. He then bites his finger and drips his blood on the contract. He was sealing it without any hesitation. That was the value of his sister's life.